Notes on the short story, part one. The short story is different from a novel, first of all, by being much shorter than a novel, and usually by just containing a single incident or a single moment in somebody's life. That somebody is, of course, the main character, and the focus is entirely on the main character, who is going to come to a certain realization at the end of the story that may be in the form of a surprise, in the form of a realization, or in the form of something subtle that's going to change his or her understanding of their place in reality. Now, the main character is of interest to us because for us, the main character is not somebody we identify with. The main character is different from us. And that's another way in which the short story brings us a story a character that's a little different than the character we identify with in a novel, as a rule, of course. Now, the main character can be somebody that we recognize as somebody who we could run into, but not somebody who we see as ourselves in any way. The main character is different, and that's one of the meanings of the short story. The short story brings us into a mode or a perception of life that illustrates how different people are from each other. And in the end, somehow that's going to change, but we'll get to that in a minute. The main character, therefore, we have to understand, is different from you or me, different from the reader, we would say. Why are we interested in the main character? Well, that's what's interesting about the short story. We get interested in somebody who's not like ourselves. Now, I know in high school you probably learned that, yes, you can read a short story and try to find out how you're similar to this person. Wrong approach. You want to find out why you're interested in this person with whom you have no common ground, you could say. You could be a man or a woman, of course, and you're going to find either one of them very interesting in the context of the story. Now, the main character, we have to understand, exists at a certain time and a certain place, and we should be careful to identify that. The person may be a person who lives in New York, a person who lives in Paris, London, or some other city of the world, may live in the southern part of the country, may live in the north, may live out west, etc., etc., etc. Usually different from where we live. So that, again, we experience a distinct difference, a distancing between ourselves and the main character. That's something we want to understand about the meaning in the short story, because the meaning has to do with how a certain character is separate from a sense of reality, and from other people as well. By the end of the short story, that may change a bit. That may change a bit in the sense that at the very end of the story, we may come to a kind of rapport with the person, an aesthetic rapport, an understanding, and maybe even a sympathy. And that's something we have to try to be aware of as the story comes to an end. The ending is often a surprise. It's a surprise that's ironic, and the surprise comes perhaps both to the reader and the main character in the story. And sometimes there's a double surprise. It's a double shotgun surprise, you might say, at the very end. So the short story tends to be, on the one hand, very explosive. With Edgar Allan Poe, we find that to be true. With Hemingway, we find that to be a little more subtle. But even so, that same sense of rapport at the end, which is not always agreeable to the reader, but is nevertheless human or sympathetic to the reader in an aesthetic way, so that we come to understand that we are all part of a certain reality that's full of ironies and maybe sometimes full of horror. So the short story is rather interesting if we want to take a look at it in this way. So we want to understand that as the story comes to an end, you're going to get a surprise, or you're going to say to yourself, something has happened here. Maybe I should sit and try to figure out what's happening. When you're reading a Hemingway story, as we're going to be reading, you'll see that this is the response. When you're reading Edgar Allan Poe or some other authors, you'll see the ending is going to be right there, smack in your face, so to speak. Now, we want to understand that there's another character in the story, usually, and that character is something of an antagonist. But the difference between the main character and the antagonist is that it's the main character who's more fluid, who's going to somehow change. Now, we have a context. The context has to do with time and place, but it also gets into more specific details. And usually we find that the character is interested in separating himself or herself from that reality, so that by the end of the story, we're going to find that there's going to be an ironic moment when that difference or distinction or distancing is going to occur as an explosive reconsideration. The main character is going to find himself in that reality that he or she has tried to avoid. So we want to know that, and we want to understand what is happening when we're reading that story. So make a note of when it's happening, could be sometime in history, and where it's happening, someplace around the globe. We're going to find different settings for the stories that we read. And I'm going to continue with this, of course, in part 2 as we go along here. But keep that in mind. Again, I'll just review what I said. You want to see that you are different from the character that you're reading about. You want to notice how the character is somehow trying to avoid a reality, and then by the end finds himself or herself actually captured by the reality. But also at that very moment, it's a time when you as the reader, when we as readers, find ourselves in some form of sympathy with, or understanding, let's say, with the character with whom we never had any identification with. All right, so let's see how that goes. So much for today. Thanks.